Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Can Atheists Know God? In this video, we're going to be looking at, Can Atheists Know of God's Knowledge? In this series, we are examining the question of whether God could prove his properties even if he manifested himself before an atheist, willing to do anything to convince that atheist that he was God. Imagine that you do not believe in God, but one day your friend Bob walks up to you and says that he has a secret he wants to tell you. He's actually an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God. Maybe the Christian God, maybe Allah, pick your favorite Abrahamic tradition. He's aware that you're a non-believer, and he really wants to save your soul, so he's willing to do anything in his power to prove to you that in fact he is all good, all-powerful, and all-knowing. Is there anything that you can ask him to do that will prove justifiably that he has the properties of God? In this video, we're going to be looking at whether God could prove that he is omniscient. In other words, if there's any evidence that someone could provide you with to demonstrate that they know absolutely everything. In the last video, as with the last video, take a moment to think, what would you ask Bob to prove that he was not just very, very knowledgeable, but that he was in fact omniscient? Just take a second. You can pause the video if you want. What would you ask Bob if someone approached you and said, I am God, I am omniscient, I'll do anything you want to prove it? Now, before the advent of the internet, you might have thought to ask Bob a number of esoteric facts that are well documented in encyclopedias about mathematics or the properties of the universe. However, today, Google allows anyone to have such answers at their fingertips. Bob could have a cleverly hidden earpiece and a team of researchers looking up the answers online. Such questions could be answered by your smartphone, are not particularly helpful in proving God's omniscience, unless you think that Wikipedia is God. Maybe you ask Bob to read your mind. If Bob knows everything, he must know what you're thinking right now. He must be able to guess the number you're thinking of, for example. However, there are many stage magicians and psychics that make a living off of cold reading people, using body language to tell what they're thinking. At best, this might prove that Bob is a real psychic that can actually read your mind. At worst, Bob's just a very talented charlatan. What about something more difficult? What if you asked Bob to predict the future? Flip a coin or roll a dice 100 times and ask him to call it. Ask him to predict the exact lottery numbers for tomorrow. Even if Bob isn't God, you could certainly make a lot of money off him this way, if he's telling the truth. There seem to be sufficiently complicated events in the future that you might be able to rule out modern methods of science and stage trickery for. However, there's no telling if Bob is not a time traveler or a supercomputer that can compute the force and velocity of a coin to determine how it will land. Perhaps Bob is actually psychic, and he can see the future. While revolutionary, this would not mean that Bob is omniscient, just very different from anything we've seen in the world so far. Simply because Bob might break scientific realism as we know it, doesn't mean Bob is God, just that Bob maybe can see the future. Perhaps you think then we should ask Bob something harder yet, something we don't know yet and cannot test. For example, exactly how many living things are there right now? Exactly how many atoms are there in the universe? Bob might give us answers to these questions, but it doesn't seem we could know if he was right. In other words, there are some things that one would need to know to be omniscient, but we could never prove these claims to be correct, and therefore we could never prove that they actually knew them. Beyond these claims about numbers and of atoms in the universe, Gödel's incompleteness theorems have shown that in any language complicated enough to represent basic arithmetic, there are statements which are true but unprovable. In other words, there will always be statements that Bob must know to be omniscient, but we could never prove that they are true, and so could never prove if he is lying. In other words, there is some statement X such that if Bob does not know X, Bob is not omniscient. But if Bob does know X, there's no way for us to prove that Bob knows X, and therefore there's no way to prove that Bob is omniscient and not someone that knows everything but X and simply lies about X. Basically, there are three classes of questions we could ask Bob. Answers that we can check right now that are Wikipedia-able, as it were. Answers that we can check in the future, these are future predictions. And answers that we will never be able to check, incomplete, unprovable questions. Given an infinite amount of time, we might be justified in believing that Bob knew the answers to the first two categories of propositions. We might ask him every single question that we can check. but we can never know if he's right about the third category, because inherently those are answers that are unprovable, but are facts about the world. There's no way to prove that Bob knows exactly how many atoms there were in the universe 100,000 years ago. But we need to be able to check that in order to prove that Bob knows it. Premise 1. There are some questions we can never check the answers to. How many atoms there were in the universe exactly 100 million years ago, Gödel statements, etc. Premise 2. To be justified in claiming someone is omniscient based on empirical evidence, you must be able to test if they know the answer to any question. Therefore, we can never be justified in believing someone is omniscient because we cannot test the answers to every question they would be required to know the answers to in order to be omniscient. As with the last argument, there are caveats. You might think that there are non-empirical ways to prove omniscience, such as the ontological argument. I have over 100 objections to that argument elsewhere, but this argument doesn't touch it. You might also think that if Bob were all good, and all good people always tell the truth, you could take his word for it that he knows everything. Therefore, the strength of this argument, as with the previous one, will also rely on the last argument of this series, that you cannot have justified knowledge of someone's omnibenevolence. It's also important to note, once again, this argument is an epistemic argument, not a metaphysical one. It is an argument about what you can know, not what is true. Even in a possible world where an all-knowing God, all-good, all-powerful God does exist, the point is you cannot know that you are in that world if he presented himself to you, because you can never prove his omniscience using empirical means. A big thank you to Tyler James for supporting Carneades.org on Patreon since 2020. You too can support the channel and get access to Patreon exclusive posts for just $2 a month, less than the price of buying me a cup of coffee once a month. If you want to support public philosophy, please do consider donating. Any amount of donation or support really does help. What do you think? Is there something you would ask Bob that would prove to you that he knows absolutely everything, even claims that you can't test? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.